First of all, I think it's vitally important as a community that we do acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, whose land we're on here today, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the Andrews Labor government is committed to truth, treaty and voice. And when it comes to voice, we support the federal government's efforts around a voice to Parliament, and we too will be doing exactly the same in terms of providing for a voice for the Indigenous community, our First Peoples nations. So, this is the start of a new era in many ways. It's also an era where we can start to take an assessment of the journey that we've been through, the opportunities that we've taken, and the things that we need to recognise we could have done better. Because I think quite often in public life there's this desire for politicians to pretend, at least to create this air of bravado that we are perfect in every way and no mistakes ever been made. Well, let me tell you here today, I'm not perfect. I know it'll be hard for you to believe, but none of us are perfect, and we've been through a time that has been not only trying, but has tested us, our resolve as a community, our sense of cohesion, and our sense of what the future holds for us and our part in it. So this is the start of a new era, the post-COVID era, for the state and for its finances, might I say. This is a budget that looks after people and the future. It's, in many ways, two budgets in one. We're paying off the COVID emergency debt, the credit card that we use to save lives and livelihoods, and we're ensuring, while our kids might have quite vivid memories of what was a traumatic time that they had to live through, that they won't be paying for it. These measures are temporary, targeted, and above all else, they're responsible. And in many respects, that's one side of the budget. The other side is continuing to invest in jobs and the projects that build our state, and we're doing what matters. We're delivering the commitments that we took to the election 6 months ago, every one of them in full. So as you go through the budget papers, you might from time to time say, well, I don't think there's a particular project that's been funded to the level that the government committed to. Let me take away any fears that you may have. The government may have put a particular number against a project for the purposes of doing the planning and the preparation work, but I've also put aside in contingency the capacity to deliver those projects entirely consistently with our Labor financial statement. And why do we do that? Well, we want to know exactly that the issues have been adequately managed by the ministers and the departments charged with responsibility. And quite frankly, I don't release the money out of that contingency until I'm happy with the way that the project is being managed. So that's a bit more about quality control and management than it is about us trying to not disclose what the costs are. If you saw a number in our pre-election commitments, those numbers are being reflected in the allocations to those particular projects. And as a consequence, we're building hospitals, schools, road and rail that Victorians need, not just now, but in the next 10, 20 and 30 years' time. We're investing to keep Victoria growing fast, and we're continuing to put jobs at the top of the tree, our priority, and indeed one of the things that in many ways sets this government apart. We do this because ultimately it's not just the dignity of work, it's the economic independence that it provides that sits so centrally in the ethos of this government. Let me take you through a few key points of the budget. Last year, we took a positive plan to the Victorian people. It was a plan for better hospitals, world-class schools, and the road and rail our growing state needs. It was a plan for a cleaner, cheaper renewable energy, a plan for the very best start in life for our kids, and a plan to help Victorians with the rising cost of living. So this budget funds every election commitment we made. A little bit about the economy. Our economy is operating in an incredibly resilient and strong way. Might I say, beyond my expectations how well it's holding up. You'll remember that the first step, well, you probably might not, I get quite excited about our fiscal strategy, but you might not remember it, but our first step in our fiscal strategy is to support jobs, and we've delivered in spades on that. The unemployment rate is below 4%, as it's been for the past year. Now, let me put that in some historical context for you. That hasn't happened for nearly 50 years in this country. Quite phenomenal. So since September 2020, the Victorian labour market has added almost 440,000 jobs, with 4 out of 5 of those jobs actually being full-time positions. It means, if you think about it, 1 in 8 jobs that exist in the Victorian community today didn't exist 2.5 years ago. It is a phenomenal level of growth. And indeed, not only are we creating more jobs than any other state or territory for that matter in the nation, in per capita terms, we're creating more jobs than any other, we're creating more jobs in absolute terms than any other jurisdiction. Now think about that. New South Wales doesn't have the biggest city in the nation, I would argue, anymore. But what it certainly does have in the state is a bigger population. We put on more than 106,000 more jobs in absolute terms than the entire state of New South Wales did over that period. So it's quite a phenomenal upswing. So the underemployment rate also is around a 20-year low. So this budget really strengthens progress against our fiscal strategy. The first step was to create jobs and to restore economic growth, and I think we can put a tick in that box. We can't assume that it's going to remain that way forever, but we can at least take the satisfaction of knowing that we've achieved that objective. The second step is to reach an operating cash surplus. We'll deliver a higher cash surplus in 22-23 than predicted in the pre-election budget update of about $2.9 billion. And we'll continue to forecast operating cash surpluses right across the forward estimates. The third step is to reach an operating surplus, and that's a little more tricky to not just look at the cash side of the ledger, but to look at the entirety of our operating accounts. An operating surplus basically means that we have to manage for depreciation of a very substantial asset base of the state. So it's quite a difficult thing for us to do in the current environment, but I really am pleased to say that this budget, we forecast an operating surplus of $1 billion in 2025-26 and $1.2 billion in 2026-27. The fourth step is to stabilise debt. Can't really do it until you get to an operating surplus. So we're making progress in this budget on that, with net debt to GSP almost stabilised in the final 2 years of the forward estimates. But we're not there yet, and there's no room for complacency or triumphalism, but I'm getting increasingly confident. This is a budget, as I said, in 2 parts: doing what we said we would and delivering a COVID debt repayment plan. When the pandemic hit Victoria, we acted quickly and decisively to safeguard the economy, and of course to prevent the economic scarring that would have come from a government simply leaving everybody to their own devices. That would have left a generation out of work, and we've seen it historically where governments believe in the market making decisions and them keeping out of the equation. It was essentially what led us into the Great Depression. But what led us out of the Great Depression was an entire change of attitude, an attitude that said government has to be the stimulus that provides the confidence to business and to the community that there is a way through. So I often said to many of my Treasury colleagues during the height of the pandemic, well, we're all Keynesians now. Even the Liberals were Keynesians. We all believed in spending money, and it was the right thing to do. And if anybody believes in the well-being of their communities, you have to put aside ideological and economic dogma and recognise that ultimately your choices are about whether your balance sheet is more important than the well-being of the community. I'm pleased to say that regardless of the political divide, we all agreed that the community came first. So we had to borrow something like $31.5 billion to save jobs and to save lives and to get through. We're not the only government in this position, but we are, in fact, the only government in the nation with a plan to manage it with our COVID debt repayment plan. With the economy strong, now is the time to confront the situation squarely, to repay the COVID debt that kept Victoria going through the pandemic. We'll repay that debt over 10 years by 2033. The plan is temporary, it's targeted, and above all, it's responsible. The repayment plan is structured in a way that's reasonable and proportionate to ability to pay, recognising that there are still long-term enduring adverse effects from the pandemic. We have to see where those problems are, and we have to continue to make allowances for those sections in the community that need the continuing support of government. The government, of course, will also do its bit. There are three parts to the plan: the COVID debt levy, government rebalancing the public service, and the Victorian Future Fund. So the COVID debt levy is targeted at those with the greatest ability to pay following the pandemic. Total business profits between 2020 to 2022 amounted to $996 billion, which is 24% higher than in the preceding 3 years. My suspicion is probably some of the $250 billion that went out of government coffers into business balance sheets played a part in at least some of the spike in that profitability. Business profit margins were also higher than usual across this period. We think big business has the capacity to make a modest additional contribution over the next 10 years in repaying COVID debt. The COVID debt levy has two components. The first component is on large businesses with payrolls above $100 million. Now that's about the largest 5% of Victorian employers that will be affected. It'll raise about $3.9 billion over 4 years, and it'll be in place for 10 years until 2033, at which point the legislation that introduces the charge will automatically terminate the charge. Land values and rents have increased substantially. The chart on the left really shows that over the past 10 years, the average site value of residential land grew by 84%. That's just the dirt that we're talking about. The chart on the right shows residential prices. The rental market has tightened significantly over the past 12 months, and the rental vacancy rate in Melbourne has fallen to a low 12%. So this has put upward pressure on rents. And believe me, we'll no doubt get to have a conversation about this, but what is happening in terms of the rental market and the spike in rental prices is a function of the basic laws of supply and demand. We need more stock in the market. The advertised rents, as I say, have risen strongly, up by 25% in metropolitan Melbourne over the past 12 months. The same is true of regional Victoria, with advertised rents that have risen by 37% over the past 3 years. So as I say, this is a function of supply and demand, and I'd ask you to contemplate this if you fall for the belief that there's a pass-on capacity for business into rental prices. When we were at the height of the lockdown periods, and of course we saw through that 3-year period regional rents rise by 37%. You also saw some very substantial tax breaks given to the regional landlords by the state government. So if the argument is that as soon as you put a tax increase in place, then you will see a commensurate increase in the rental amount, well, we certainly didn't see the converse apply in regional Victoria. And that's not a criticism, that's just how the market operates. It's the laws of supply and demand. We saw an exodus of people from metropolitan Melbourne. We saw the population spiking in regional Victoria, and you basically go to the demand that exists in the marketplace. So we think it's fair that Victorians with multiple properties make a modest contribution to repaying COVID debt. The second part of the COVID debt levy is really a temporary decrease in the tax-free threshold and a modest increase in land tax rates. Land tax is paid by landlords, Victorian and holiday homes and commercial and industrial properties. All current land tax exemptions will continue to apply, including those relating to the principal place of residence exemption. The average increase is about $1,300 or around $3.50 a day. So really, to put that into some context, this is based on a land holding of about $650,000. So I woke up, unfortunately, very early this morning, and I was thinking this argument about, well, if you're talking about a property having an enormous increase, and $1,300 on land tax sounds like a lot of money. It's certainly more allowance than my wife gives me a week. But can I tell you, if you think a bit about this, the average on an average property of the tax increase is about $3.50 a day. So it's a $650,000 piece of land. So over the last 10 years, an average property will have appreciated by 84%. So by that, it turns into the appreciation day by day on the value of that property is $230 a day. That's on a capital asset of about $1 million. So the dirt, 650, the entire capital asset, about $1 million. So let me put that into context for you. The tax increase is 1/66th of the asset appreciation, or 1.5%. Now, nobody likes paying taxes, and I can tell you from a personal point of view, I don't like paying taxes either. So we can all be on a unity ticket in respect to that. But we all expect government to be able to provide the services and the opportunities that a well-resourced state can provide, particularly for the next generation. So I think we can also assume, short of leaving us all to our own devices, then it's important that we properly resource the state. And we have to find those resources from somewhere. And can I say, with no degree of satisfaction at all, it's important that we make these changes. So that component is estimated to raise about $4.7 billion over the budget year and the forward estimate, so the next 4 years, and it will apply up to and including the 2033 land tax year. Now, if I could dispel the myth that Victoria is a high taxing state. In fact, we are not. In fact, in many ways, depending on how you look at the data, we are the lowest taxing state. So this is from no more august body than the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which provides comparable data for all jurisdictions up to 2021-22. Total revenue per capita was actually lower in Victoria than any other state or territory. And as you can see from this chart, there's been the order of things effectively for the last decade. So when we're looking at revenue, you can't simply look at state taxes because governments run on revenue. If you're West Australia, for example, half your revenue is effectively royalties. And we know that everybody in the media, the opposition, everybody says royalties are taxes. Well, technically speaking, they're not, but they certainly are revenue. And every time the opposition produces a sheet about how many taxes and charges the state government's put in place, gold royalty, imagine we were giving the stuff away for free until I put a gold royalty on. Gold royalty, increase in brown coal royalty, the few resources that this state actually has, they're equated as tax increases by the opposition, and might I say, by the media in many cases. So in practical terms, you have to look at your revenue stream. And of course, let's not forget the other great revenue stream. About 50% of the revenue that the state of Victoria receives are federal allocations. So if you're in the state of Victoria and you started to join me in my outrage about the fact that for decades, the state of Victoria, well, not decades, let's say since Federation, the state of Victoria has subsidised the rest of the nation, it's true, not 1 year, even when the state of Victoria was considered a laughingstock by other states. Remember the fun they had at our expense when they considered us a rust bucket state? We were still subsidising the Federation back then. So I think we probably have to look at how horizontal fiscal equalisation is being applied. That is the money that the Commonwealth applies to make the poorer states do a little bit better than what is considered to be a rich state, Victoria. So it's revenue, state taxes, royalties, and of course concessions and allocations from the Commonwealth Government. So we raise very little revenue from royalties, as I said. Resource-rich state raise nearly equal parts of royalty income and taxation revenue. Comparisons that exclude royalty are therefore halving the revenue burden imposed by some jurisdictions. And of course, we've long been shortchanged by the GST and Commonwealth grants. I live in hope, and I've got to say, I've found the engagement with the current federal government a little nicer than the engagement with the previous one, but I'm still waiting to see a bit more delivered our way. Even if, now these numbers are 21, 22 because that's a lag in the data, but, and I hear you say, I've cherry-picked the data to make it look good. So I went back to Treasury and I said, I want you to give me an assurance that the indicative data that we've produced here also reflects the increases that we've put in this budget on these numbers. And they've come back, and by the way, that puts us at a substantial comparative disadvantage because we're accounting for decisions we've made in this budget, whereas we haven't seen what the other states are doing to deal with their fiscal consolidation strategies. Great term, by the way, Paul. I'm going to use it everywhere I go from now on. So what Treasury have told me is even if the 21-22 numbers shown here were adjusted for indicative per capita impact of revenue decisions taken in this budget, Victoria would still be the second lowest revenue state. We'd go above South Australia, but remain below New South Wales, Queensland, and the rest for that matter. So I'm expecting to marshal you all into the support of the outrage of the conservative nonsense that we hear touted around, that Victoria is a high taxing state. When you talk taxes, and you want to get the story right, you've got to talk revenue. If you're running a business and you're thinking about where you want to employ, you look at the burden that you actually have to bear as a business. So, can I tell you, Victoria's a great place to do business because comparatively we are the best, maybe the second best, according to Treasury, under this data, place to do business. And South Australia's a great place, they got good wine. I'm just not sure that you'd want to run a business exclusively from there. So, finally, the Victorian Future Fund will be used to manage COVID debt. In last year's budget, we established the fund using proceeds from the Vic Roads modernisation joint venture. We were clear at the time that the fund would be used to manage COVID debt. The fund's balance is around $8 billion and it will offset COVID debt. The investments returns from the fund will be quarantined and returned to the fund so that its balance will grow over time. The government is introducing legislation alongside the budget bills to ensure that the Victorian Future Fund can only be drawn down to pay off debt, so that we avoid the silliness that we saw in the lead up to the last election, where the opposition tried to flip a realised asset from the output side, from the asset side of the balance sheet onto the output side of the balance sheet. We offered to send them Accounting 101 for dummies so that they could work it out, but finally the Parliamentary Budget Office belled the cat by making it clear that in his post-election statement that was a $30 billion error in effect by the way it had been reallocated. The government, of course, remains committed to repaying that debt, and we've shown the debt trajectory that we're proposing through the repayment schedule. The good thing about debt issued under bonds is that trajectory is clear, consistent, and you can plot a way through it. After 10 years, the levy will end and debt will be where it should have been without the pandemic. That doesn't mean we don't still have debt we have to deal with, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but it means that the debt that the government will be made up of effectively productive investments that will grow the economy and deliver a return, and will have addressed the legacy of COVID debt. There aren't too many businesses that run zero debt. I mean, if you're running a zero debt business, you've got to wonder whether or not you're running a lazy balance sheet, because debt actually properly deployed gets you to a point where you can make choices about the effective use of money. We've made those choices, and we believe an investment in the future, growing the amenity of the state and growing opportunity for all, is a vitally important part of where this government believes the future opportunities lie. So as I said, it's a budget in two parts. We're also delivering on our election commitments and continuing to invest in the services that Victorians need. I have a 60-page overview budget information paper in slides that I'll now take you through. Now, that was a joke that my office suggested that I use, but I won't use it. But what I can suggest for you is that as a community, we're continuing to invest in the infrastructure that a growing Victoria needs, creating jobs. We're improving productivity and the quality of public service delivery and transforming the state like no other government has done. The Victorian Government infrastructure investment is expected to average $19.6 billion a year over the budget and forward estimates. Yeah, you can see that number coming down a little bit, and it does have to come down, and it will continue to come down for a while, can I say. The infrastructure investment is vitally important, investing in health, housing, education, transport and cultural precincts, as well as major productivity enhancing projects such as North East Link, Metro Tunnel, Westgate Tunnel, Suburban Rail Loop and the Level Crossing Removal Program. We'll also expand eligibility for TAFE so all Victorians can study for in-demand jobs like healthcare, mental health, construction, early childhood and hospitality, including $186 million to expand eligibility criteria for subsidised training courses, including free TAFE. We're going to put $90 million to meet the expected demand for training while providing additional literacy, numeracy and digital support for free TAFE students. We're provisioning $170 million to build and upgrade TAFE campuses across the state so Victorians can continue to study in quality facilities. We're putting $12 billion to support our local councils, and that includes funding to create traineeships and apprenticeships in the local government sector, helping to fill critical shortages. And any of you in areas relating to planning would know exactly what I'm talking about. We'll keep working to boost Victoria's economy and targeted industry investments to drive innovation, secure our supply chain, support businesses and back our regions. And a shout out to Minister Carroll. This is of course going to be mostly your responsibility, and it's vitally important that we do create this culture of innovation. $12.3 million to continue supporting our growing mRNA industry and assisting sovereign mRNA manufacturing in Victoria. I can't tell you exactly how stratospheric our growth has been in medical research and medical technology. We are now considered certainly the third most advanced centre in the world for medical technology. They would say that Boston beats us. I would argue that we're at least level pegging with London, but we are definitely third, and we have come really out of nowhere in a very short period of time, 10, 15 years. We are doing great work with BioNTech. I went to Germany and met them in Marburg in Germany and brought them back to Melbourne. They said some incredible things about Melbourne, such as they've never seen an innovation incubator like Melbourne, not since the 1980s in Boston. So that's a pretty heartwarming comparison. We're putting aside $36 million for Made in Victoria to cement Victoria as Australia's manufacturing engine room, supporting local businesses to expand and boost productivity, including through providing R&D grants to drive discoveries that will benefit our economy. $87 million to support the growth and sustainability of Victoria's racing industry, which has about 3,000 jobs across the state. $12 million to help our exporters expand and strengthen their connections to international markets. $35 million to support disadvantaged job seekers in Victoria by extending the Jobs Victoria Mentors program. We're also backing industries and individuals who underpin Victoria's economic success, especially across regional Victoria, including $35 million to support live music and community broadcasting, around 10,000 gigs, getting more artists back on stage through grants for musicians to perform at live music venues, as well as music festivals. $23 million to expand the Major Events Fund, promoting Victoria's calendar of events and strengthening our position as the nation's top location for major events. $21 million to support a bigger and better Bendigo Art Gallery. And of course, we're building the NGV Contemporary. This is a recognition to the outstanding work of the Victorian Chamber. I want to thank them for engaging with us in the idea that you brought to our attention in your pre-budget bids. It appealed to me, and we've come on a long journey over so many months in working out how we might transition from stamp duty to an annual property tax for commercial and industrial properties. What I am particularly thrilled about, not only your thought leadership, but the fact that you could keep the secret for as long as we did, because it required an enormous amount of work. Numerous reviews and reports have recommended swapping stamp duty for land tax, and our government is getting on and doing it. Now, we've heard many talks, many great speeches, some of which have brought a tear to my eye from politicians banging on about the need for change and efficiency and microeconomic reform. I think Paul Keating once said, everybody's so keen on microeconomic reform, you walk past a pet shop and the resident galar's banging on about it. And the truth is, it's vitally important, because the best way to deal with debt is to grow your economy. But we do have to come up with nation-leading reforms to do that. So this is big reform, big picture reform. Numerous reviews, as I say, have basically said this reform is important. It will encourage businesses to expand or set up in the best locations, for example, close to their customer or where there's a growing workforce. support businesses to invest in buildings and infrastructure, and promote more efficient use of commercial and industrial land. It'll generate a cumulative increase in the size of the Victorian economy. Now get this, of up to $50 billion in net present value terms, according to Deloitte Access Economics. The transition away from stamp duty for commercial and industrial properties will occur for every sale from the 1st of July 2024, with an annual property tax based on unimproved land value starting 10 years after that point. Current commercial and industrial properties will be exempt. The transition will only apply to those choosing to buy commercial and industrial land in the future. And of course, the clock doesn't start ticking even after that purchase for a further 10 years. Residential properties are also not affected, and there are no plans to expand this model to residential property. Now, believe me, I'm saying that with a genuine heart. Can I tell you, you've got to believe a treasurer when he says he's not foregoing $8 billion worth of revenue to affect that change. So unless Jim Chalmers has a cunning plan and a large bank book that he's prepared to open up for me, this has strained my willingness to reform, but it is a vital reform, and the Victorian Chamber and, might I say, the Property Council have been banging on about it for quite some time. So as a government, we decided it was time to bite the bullet on. Work is underway to finalise the details on the reform, with an announcement to be made by the end of 2023 and the new system to come into effect from the 1st of July 2024. But I'll just take you through a very simple 5-step way that this will operate. Step 1, the reform commences on the 1st of July 2024. People who own property prior to that date will not be affected by the reform for as long as they own that property. Step 2, after that date, the 1st of July 2024, when a commercial industrial property is transacted, it will trigger a 10-year transition period for that property. The purchaser will have a choice to either pay the property's final stamp duty liability as an upfront lump sum, which we do at the moment, or pay an annual payment for 10 years equivalent to the property's final stamp duty liability plus interest with a government-facilitated transition loan. Step 3, if the property is transacted again within the 10-year transition period, no stamp duty will be payable, even if the property is transacted multiple times. So as soon as there is a second or third or fourth transaction after the 1st of July 2024, the state of Victoria gets no money in the coffers over that 10-year transition period. So if the initial purchaser alternatively decided, no, I don't want to pay the stamp duty up front, I want a transitional loan, they will be obliged at that point to pay out the remaining repayments. And of course, that's what a settlement on property generally does. It disperses liabilities. So, step 4, the annual property tax will kick in 10 years after the initial transaction, regardless of whether or not the property has been transacted since. The annual property tax will be set at a flat 1% of that property's unimproved land value. It will be separate from and in addition to existing land tax. Step 5, after the 10-year transition period, the property has now moved permanently into the new system. No stamp duty will be payable on any transaction, and whoever owns the property will be liable for the annual property tax. So it did get a lot of coverage. I sort of get that because there's so many moving parts in this budget, but that is a gift to the future in many ways of business. So this budget also invests in small business. From the 1st of July 2024, we'll raise the payroll tax-free threshold from $700,000 to $900,000, and the following year we will increase that threshold to $1 million. Around about 6,000 businesses who otherwise have paid payroll tax will no longer pay a cent. Once the threshold reaches $1 million, and more than 26,000 businesses, or might I say around 60% of payroll tax-paying businesses will benefit in total from these changes. The benefits are estimated at about $580 million over the next 4 years. The government will also introduce a phase-out to better target the benefits of the tax-free threshold to small business. Any business with a payroll of less than about $3.6 million will benefit from these changes. To support the growth of the Victorian economy, the government will undertake further productivity-busting tax reform by abolishing business insurance duty. Insurance duty imposes a high cost on the economy. It discourages businesses from insuring themselves appropriately. It distorts decision-making, and it gets in the way of firms innovating and investing. Reducing reliance on insurance duty has also been recommended by numerous reviews, including the Henry Tax Review, the Productivity's recent 5-year productivity review. Victoria will be the first state in the nation to remove the business insurance. The abolition will be achieved by 2033, with each year we'll see 1% taken off that duty, so you'll start to see the benefits as we phase it out and might I say, replace it with nothing. This is revenue foregone by the state. So over a 10-year transition, the cumulative saving to business will be $3.6 billion, and businesses will save, get this, around $500 million each and every year thereafter. So we're also making it easier to start and run small businesses in Victoria through our regulatory reform agenda. $38 million for a government-wide regulatory reform package, and we're committing to boosting growth through the establishment of the Economic Growth Commissioner to undertake inquiries commissioned by the government into driving the next wave of productivity-boosting reforms. So, Paul, if the Victorian Chamber have any more good ideas that I could take credit for, please come forward with them. Finally, I'd just like to touch on our capital program. We're averaging $19.6 billion per year over the forward estimates. I know there's been a lot of commentary about cost blowouts, so I thought it'd be worthwhile taking you through the facts. When you look at our 130 major projects, those with a total estimated investment of more than $100 million, the net increase in cost is only, get this, 0.2%. Anybody undertaking a kitchen renovation, I bet you'd take that action if you could get it. So this demonstrates that despite some of the pressures in the construction sector, we're making prudent allocations, and our contracting arrangements are protecting the state from exposure. This is a budget in two parts. We're paying off the COVID debt we used to save lives and livelihoods, and we're continuing to invest in jobs and the projects that build our state. We're looking after people, but more importantly, we're looking after the future. And that is the presentation that we're putting, because we believe the obligations that we all carry are that much heavier as a consequence of the trauma that the economy and the community suffered as a consequence of COVID. I understand the difficulties that your businesses endured during COVID, and we understand that what you need is a partner in government. During COVID, we put $14 billion into business to keep businesses whole, and all up, we put over $31.5 billion into the community to assist them. We figure a true partnership doesn't have silent partners, we have active partners. And we think it's vitally important that that partnership endure, because the only way we're going to learn the lessons and grow from the experience of COVID is if we work together for a better tomorrow, and to learn that as a community we get so much more done when we recognise that we come from a position of mutual respect and understanding. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Treasurer. I think your closing remarks there, you only have to look out the room to know that business is here with you to be part of that conversation into the future. We may have time to take questions, so please bear with us, but to facilitate a Q&A, which the Treasurer has kindly accepted the opportunity to. Could you please make welcome Heidi Murphy, who's Channel 9 reporter, but importantly, Vice President of the Melbourne Press Club. Welcome, Heidi.
9 budgets, hardest one. Think you're in the hardest room for it tonight?
Look,
It feels like night today, sorry.
I've always enjoyed coming to the Victorian Chamber, and I wouldn't have missed this for quids, to be entirely frank. I think, yes, look, cutting to the chase, yes, this is a very difficult budget. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of moving parts. I think one of our advisors says it's a target-rich environment that has been created with all of the moving parts. And one of the things that is difficult, really, at a time when everybody's looking at, well, how do we wind back expenditure, is not to kill the economic opportunities of the state by making investments in the right place to grow opportunity. So, you know, in many ways, we're doing a lot of things in different areas all at once.
You speak of target-rich environment. I feel like there'd be some individuals in the room today who feel like they're a target. You came for them for the mental health levy a couple of years ago. You're coming for them now with a debt levy. Business feels like what were the words yesterday? Cash cow, like an ATM, like a piñata. Why are you coming after business, and how long will you keep coming after business for?
Oh, look, I think business can at least have the confidence that where we can make provision for business, and I think there's the unwritten part of this budget is the enormous reallocation and the tax cuts and opportunities that this budget provides. Yes, I think in net you would have to say that there are certain sections of the business community that would say, particularly at the high end, those who've done particularly well out of COVID in terms of profitability, that they would feel, well, why us? Well, simply because as a government, we need to replenish the capacity of the state. Why do we need to do that? Well, we saw $2 billion worth of expense around floods that afflicted Victorians. We had to step in and look after the well-being of Victorians.
But isn't that the core business of government, not the core business of business?
Well, the core business of government is to look after business when it needs support and assistance, all of which is resourced out of our tax base. And we have to reassess and adjust our tax base based on the needs of the community. But we did put $14 billion into businesses right around the state during the course of COVID to try and keep them whole. And might I say, it demonstrated its worth. Our economy bounced back to be travelling is now travelling about 25% faster than the national economy's average. So we're doing something right in terms of investing, and certainly in terms of creating and growing jobs. We are a long way out in front of the rest of the nation.
The rest of the nation brings up an interesting point. I know you're at pains then to explain we are not the highest taxing state. The Business Council thinks we are. That's the public perception, and you can't go to everyone and give them a 15-minute presentation and a selective graph from the ABS. How do you counter it? What is your pitch to business to come here, to invest here, to stay here when you're the target of new taxes at the whim of a treasurer?
Well, thanks, Heidi. It really was therapy for me more than necessarily an educative process for you. I do bang on about this, and my poor old advisors are just about exhausted by this. The truth is, if you simply cherry pick the data that is being used, and essentially the data that is being used is state taxes and local government taxes. I don't know why we get fitted up with local government taxes, but if you use that data, then on that basis only, you can probably mount a case that Victoria's at the top end. The problem with that is no treasurer, no state, no business interacts with state governments other than in the context of what their revenue base is and who pays to replenish that revenue base. So I've taken you through, well, therapy for me more than anybody else, what is essentially the real allocations. And quite frankly, as a state, we are in a much more business attractive location if you're looking at the costs that you have to pay to the state to run its balance sheet.
But that doesn't seem to be the perception publicly. How do you address that? How do you change that?
Probably by doing a bit more like this. Maybe I'm an inarticulate and ineffective advocate for what I think. I hope that we'll start to see some journalists start to pick this aside and have some genuine engagement about it. But, you know, the fact that this, can I say, banal analysis has been put forward by the opposition and picked up and run with without any criticism, I feel aggrieved.
Just your quick thoughts on a tweet from the Tasmanian Premier in the last little while. Lower taxes, cheaper power in a state that backs small business. If any Victorian businesses want a better deal to provide jobs and opportunity to Tasmanians, we'll welcome you with open arms.
I don't know where Tasmania came on that graph. We might send it down to him for further consideration, but I think Tasmania's still well and truly above us, and the point that I would make in terms of their revenue base, and you know, at the end of the day, from a national perspective, we don't have the Commonwealth Government handing out $500 million for a footy stadium for us. In fact, I'm still trying to get some money for the Commonwealth Games.
Yeah, we need something for the Commonwealth Games. I thought they were your friends.
Even my friends sometimes don't give me $500 million when I ask for it, Heidi. But we're going to work on them. And look, I'm confident they're going to do the right thing. They've given $3 billion to Brisbane for the Olympics. So,
yes. Why aren't they giving things to us, Tim?
They're just playing coy at the moment, but I'm absolutely convinced that they'll do the right thing by the state of Victoria. And if I'm not convinced, I'll let you know in no uncertain terms.
Great. I would like to make sure we throw it open because there are about 400 or so of you here, and I assume there are, given some of the businesses, the industry bodies represented in the room, I assume there are some with some questions to raise, some views to present directly to you, Treasurer. While we wait for a microphone to make their way across, and I'll just get you to give your name, where you're from, and a quick question. We don't really have time for long editorials.
Oh, that's a shame. Tim and I were going to have a good chat. David Jemicki, farmer out the west side of Victoria. One comment, two questions. First of all, when you've got rentals increasing from $200 a week versus $450 a week, that 37% increase in regional areas is still very modest. Second point, being that we talk about net debt, what is my banker always tells me there's a difference between a limit and a target. Where would you prefer the ratio, noting that we're going to get close to 25% out in forward estimates of Victoria's net debt? And then finally, just on renewable energies, agriculture relies very heavily on diesel. Where do you see hydrogen being a part of our net zero targets?
Thanks, David.
There were so many questions here, David. I don't know if I'm going to remember them all. The first one was around the escalation in rents in regional Victoria. And as I say, look, I think I've been pretty able to demonstrate that this is a function of supply and demand, and we know there are enormous difficulties being experienced in regional Victoria, being able to attract skills to those areas, in large measure because they don't have housing stock to get the requisite people into their communities. So this is a problem that we're going to have to deal with as a government and as a community. We've been working on it consistently, whether it's the lifting of the payroll tax-free threshold, the stamp duty tax-free threshold for first home buyers, whether it's our shared equity scheme or all the systems we've put into place to facilitate rent to buy. There is still going to be an enormous effort that will have to be put in, and the government has already announced that we'll be coming out with further initiatives by no later than September of this year, as we recognise that this is a problem and is going to have to be dealt with. The second question was
around net debt.
Net debt. So, what would be my perfect number? Well, it'll probably be 0.1 of 1%, I suppose, but enough to keep a credit rating, but enough never have to worry about paying, $27 billion over a forward estimates period in interest. Look, the truth is I suspect that the first priority for the government is to get that net debt number below 24.5, which is out years, the final year of the forward estimates, maybe, as you can see, it's getting close. We're only 0.1 of 1% below equalised or debt having stabilised. We've got to get there. The only way we can stabilise debt is we've got to run operating surpluses on our balance sheet. We still have a lot of COVID expenditure that's leaching its way through our balance sheet, but it's coming off, and that's why we're making the decisions we are around the winding back of the size and scale of the public service.
Any other questions?
There was a third one, but I forget it.
We'll keep... Oh, hydrogen. Diesel
diesel
prices and hydrogen.
Look, our position on blue hydrogen is, and all hydrogen for that matter, but blue hydrogen in particular, is that the government is working through a due diligence analysis of this technology and the proposal that our Japanese business partners are advocating. We won't be finalising our view on it until we've completed that due diligence. The Japanese tell us they've got about 2 years of work to do before they get to a position about whether they make the investments that they're proposing, and we'll work with them, and when we find out whether the technology stacks up in economic terms, in environmental terms and in technological delivery terms, then we'll have a look at it.
I'm conscious time is moving on, so I will ask really for very quick questions if we can, over this side of the room, and then we'll come back here.
Hi, yeah. Treasurer Deb Kerr from the Victorian Forest Products Association. Pretty disappointed about yesterday's decision about native forestry, but we'll put that to one side. You've talked today about the housing supply issues. I'm just wondering when the government and the broader Victorian community are going to have a real discussion about our timber supplies and where they're going to come from. By the time it takes to grow a pine tree in 2053, global demand will outstrip supply 4-1, and we already import 40% of Victoria imports 40% of Australia's structural timber for housing. We need to get serious about this conversation.
All right, thank you. Where are we getting the timber from, Tim? And I will ask a follow-up to that. The 200 million, how much is for business and how much is for the workers with the timber plan?
We'll have a bit more to say about the breakup of those allocations, but make no mistake, we're going to have to work very closely with businesses, particularly those in the harvesting and haulage area, those who run heavy equipment. We're going to need that equipment to keep our fire trails safe, deal with bushfire management and parks management. So certainly from our perspective, the challenges that we've confronted with constant legal actions, look, honestly, have led us to the view, and certainly the legal advice we got from the Solicitor General is that there is no likelihood that we can get to a point where there is certainty of being able to extract resource out of our native forests. I don't say this with any degree of satisfaction or triumphalism, as some on the green side of politics have. We don't do this with any degree of happiness, but we've had people basically sitting at home, basically being paid by the state, while essentially court orders of injuncted activity, and it's just not fair to those communities to pretend that we have a pathway through when the courts and the law doesn't seem to be able to facilitate that.
All right, a question down the middle.
Treasurer, hi, Alan Blood from a firm called Victorian Hydrogen and Ammonia Industries Limited. And thank you for your speech, it was very, very informative. I'm a part West Australian and a part Victorian, so I'm a bit different to a lot of other people. So no comments on GST, please.
Just a nice quick question, please.
Yes. Tim, you have, like West Australia, an enormous resource in your brown coal. Now, no one wants more environmentally polluting industries, but the brown coal can be utilised in a way which is zero emissions for a variety of projects, hydrogen being one and so on. So one of the issues, though, is seemingly conflict within government on environmental aspects. Now, if that huge resource, which is an enormous asset of the state, can be utilised in such a way, it makes zero emissions outcomes, creates the jobs that you want, creates billions of dollars of revenue that you want. It doesn't matter if it's brown coal, bananas or pineapples. It's a resource of the state, of great value to the state, so why don't we use the jolly thing? Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Alan. Look, as a government, we are committed to a process that will see eventually our brown coal emitters wind down. They will essentially, and we hope to see, them being replaced by clean and renewable energy, and that will make a very substantial contribution towards the government's attaining of its renewable energy and its carbon emissions target. In terms of utilisation of brown coal resource into the future, I see it as being relatively limited. We'll go through our due diligence on HESC, but beyond HESC, I think the best thing for this industry would be to wait and see what the government does on HESC, and we haven't yet finalised a view, and it will be a serious and diligent attempt to work through the economic, the environmental and the technological challenges of that project.
Treasurer, well, I think there may have been one more question over this side around the, I think I recognise the moustache of the real estate gentleman. Quinton, is that you? We'll get a microphone to you, hold on. In the meantime, the contingency funds that you've set aside for all of the projects while you wait for the Commonwealth Games cash, is it like a very big fund? How confident are you that that Commonwealth money is going to come for all of those projects that are on hold?
Oh, well, most of the contingency that you're seeing, far and away most of it, is basically put aside for a number of reasons that are generally predictable. On the output side of the ledger, it tends to be around demand in our hospital system and our education system.
I mean, particularly the projects, though.
So, capital side of the ledger, most of it is held largely for LFS projects or projects that are currently out in a competitive process in the market. So, we're not going to tell the people that we're trying to extract value from exactly what price we think it should go for, otherwise we do the taxpayer a disservice. So I hold those monies and I release them to delivery agencies and ministers once we have confidence in them, and essentially that's as it should be, I think.
Question?
Thank you, Heidi. To Treasurer, two parts. Very quickly, though, just to correct some of your narrative, and while I'd like to correct your budget, I will correct the narrative. The vacancy rate you quoted is not actually 12%, it's closer to 1.2%, which is a little bit different to 12%, but there we go. You talked about supply and demand. Now, Treasurer, your budget contained no measures to alleviate the current supply issues in the residential rental market, which is, as you state, the underlying cause of this rental crisis we're in. It did, however, increase the taxation burden on family investors who make up 70% of Victoria's rent providers and small business owners. These are the same people who, through COVID, were mandated to provide rental relief and are now trying to make ends meet with rising costs. So my question to you is, how is your government planning to address the increasing pressures on renters in Victoria when, as a result of these tax increases, we see more rental providers and small business owners leaving the sector and thereby further diminishing supply and putting more upward pressure on costs?
Thanks for that, and I apologise if I read 12%. It was 1.2%. That was the number my staff put in my speech. So
you cannot throw staff under the bus.
Yeah, it was the number my staff put on. No, what I was saying is I got it wrong, not my staff. It only further highlights my point that this is an issue around the fact that we don't have enough supply into the market. So we all agree on that. What's the government doing about it? We are basically, as we've been doing consistently, remember this is a government that produced a Homes for Victorians strategy about 2 years into our term, and we've been consistently pursuing policies aimed to generate more activity. We do understand that there are multifaceted parts to this industry. It's not just about home ownership, but that's something we certainly, from a policy perspective, promote and encourage. And that's why our policy settings promote and encourage getting people into their first home. But we also have to recognise that renters need a fair deal, and we've legislated a fairer deal for renters. And we need to recognise that the state has to be prepared to use innovative methods to encourage people getting into their home. So if you're a first home buyer or somebody looking for a principal place of residence, the state, in a nation-leading approach through our Home Buyer Fund, will take 25% equity in a qualifying applicant's home so that we could take some of the some of the mortgage insurance costs off them, so that we take effectively a quarter of the mortgage repayments off them, and we make it easier for them to get the asset that better fits their needs. So we're doing a lot in this space. I absolutely accept there is more that we need to do, and that's why the Premier has announced that the government will be producing a housing and planning strategy towards sometime in September.
3 more very quick ones from me, Treasurer. I'll ask quick questions. You give quick answers, I should hope. Any plans to introduce a rent freeze?
Look, I've certainly, from my perspective, I think governments getting involved in the issue of putting a freeze on rents would be a massive distortion of the market. I think there is an issue that we have to deal with, and that is why rents are rising as quickly as they are, and what can we do to avoid those rises being as great as they are.
Was that a yes or was that a yes or a no? Yeah.
Well, rent freeze is a definite no.
Definite no, right?
Can we do more around stopping the increase in rents at the disproportionately high level that they are at the moment? Metropolitan Melbourne, 25%. I think we can do more.
With a rent cap?
Let's think about it. We don't have a firm view, but I do think there has to be a point at which the community says, this has gone beyond reason. The level that probably some of the poorest people who are not asset rich at all are getting encumbered with costs. And 1 in 3 Victorian households rent, and they do need and deserve the attention and support of government.
Won't a cap be an intervention?
Well, I'm not suggesting that we won't intervene in the way that the housing market operates. We've been doing that with great regularity in an attempt to get a more equitable way that the market operates. It's a question of what interventions are the most appropriate.
Those were supplementary questions. My second last question is this. I know you liked Paul Guerra's idea around stamp duty relief, stamp duty changes for commercial properties and business properties. What about payroll tax? Any plans to consider some fairly sizable changes to payroll tax as a whole?
What do you got in mind?
Get rid of it?
Well, if you can find $8 billion for me as an alternative to it, sure. Or we could have open air schools as an alternative, Heidi.
All right, fine. And my final question is that the Premier appeared at the budget lock-up yesterday. I don't recall him ever doing that. Some of the reasons put to me for it were he was trying to steal your thunder, he was helping you with a tough sell, or it was his last one, so he thought he'd pop in. Whose idea was it for him to swing by?
Believe me, he wasn't trying to steal my thunder. The unwritten story of this budget is exactly how hands-on the Premier has been, and quite frankly, we had a chat last night about it, and I said, look, I could not have landed this budget without him, and I mean that quite genuinely. He gets it. He understands the nature of the fiscal challenges that we confront, and he's prepared to back his Treasurer in. So he could, I said to him, you can do the budget presentation if you want. You're much more articulate than me, but of course he figures, well, Treasurer's got to do his job.
So was his idea to come or yours?
It was his idea to come, but when he floated it with me saying it's up to you, I said, of course you can come. You can do my speech if you want. So believe me, I am very much indebted to the Premier for the incredible work that he's put in during this budget, and I don't think he gets the level of acknowledgement he should.
Treasurer, thank you. I'd now like to invite to the stage Nick Richardson, the CEO of the Melbourne Press Club.
Look at that seamless Melbourne Press Club handball. Thank you, Heidi. On behalf of the Melbourne Press Club, I'd like to thank Paul and the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry for the partnership that enables this annual event to be held. The post-budget lunch has become a staple of budget post-mortems and allows all of us to delve deeper into the budget detail and reflect on the bigger picture. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Melbourne Press Club sponsors whose support ensures we can keep offering a range of engaging events for the Victorian media industry. This is Tim Pallas's 9th budget, although if he suggests today there was 2 budgets in one, perhaps it's his 10th as well. That represents about a decade of challenges and changes, some of them predictable, many of them not, and we all know the biggest and most recent of those. All of us understand the principles of budgeting, but only a few of us have to do it in the glare of the media spotlight and with the deep and appropriate scrutiny from all our stakeholders. Every day, Victorians apply the reality stress test to these budgets, so it's essential that those who frame the budgets are able to explain and help us understand the decisions they've made and how that budget works. It's a representation of a robust democracy, and it's something that we in the media appreciate and look forward to. So I would like to thank Treasurer Tim Pallas for submitting himself once again to this scrutiny. I'm glad he enjoys it because we enjoy having him here. So will you please join with me in thanking him for today's post-budget lunch.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Treasurer, and thank you, Heidi. Big round of applause again for Heidi. Well done. To you, Nick, thank you again for your support. Great to see so many of your membership here today as well. I've ran into Hugh Nayland, Richard Willingham, Shannon Alvella's here, Mark Santamartino's here. I saw Shannon Deary earlier. I think there's over 2 tables from the press community that we have in this state. We're really well served by the press gallery, and thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for being here as well. I mentioned earlier that this is our biggest budget lunch, and I'd like to thank our outstanding events team and to the Press Club's outstanding team as well for a job well done again. So a round of applause for them. And a very special thank you to our General Manager of Events, Melanie Parks. Mel's been with us for the better part of a decade, and this is the last major Victorian Chamber event she'll oversee before commencing her maternity leave, hopefully in about a month's time. So to Mel, thank you and good luck for what the next 12 months has in store for you. Big round of applause for Mel. And finally, to our Treasurer. Business needs certainty. We have no further capacity to take more tax or levy heights and continue to contribute to the community. Like you, we want a strong business sector here. We'd love to be able to commit that COVID debt comes off sooner if growth and the initiatives that we put around growth bite sooner and pay that debt down. We'd love to see a continued contribution and commitment to growth on top of that as well. And you can be certain that Becky will continue to bring ideas to you that have been thought through and contributed by our members as well. Ultimately, business needs certainty, and the business community wants to engage in that certainty as well. Because if we have certainty, we continue to grow confidence, and ultimately with confidence, we'll be able to accelerate ahead, and we look forward to working with you and the government on that. So that then brings us to the end of our formalities for today. I'd encourage you all to stay, make sure that you catch up with somebody that you haven't caught up with for a while, and let's have a chat about what the future looks like. I look forward to having a drink with you, and may you have a great week ahead. Thank you again for joining us.